Carney looks impressive on paper, and I can understand why Canadians think he's the man for the moment, because he was vetted, for example, by the Brits, who put him in charge of the Bank of England. But I can also tell you what happened when he was in charge of the Bank of England. And I know this because I know people who were affected, and I mean rich people, who were affected by his decisions as head of the Bank of England. So the policies that Carney put forward as the head of the Bank of England produced an asset boom. And what that means is that stock prices went upward radically. And what that meant was that the people who have a tremendous amount of money got a lot more money as a consequence of Carney's maneuvering. And that, I would say, shows you that's a good case example of exactly who he prioritizes, despite his protestations, when push comes to shove. And so the people that I've been talking to, and these are very wealthy people and they're very well connected, although they have a conscience, as it turns out, we're not very happy that the quantitative easing principles that Carney put into place in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis made the rich much richer and the rest of everyone else, and that meant everyone but the extremely rich, substantially poorer. And so that's an example of what happened when Carney was running the Bank of England. And so there's no evidence that he's like a friend of yours. And so, okay, now, then we might address another issue. It's like the issue of Trump and his saber rattling. Well, the accusations that have gone out with regards to Pierre Poilievre is that Poilievre is just MAGA light. You know, he's a Make America Great advocate, which he's not, by the way, and that a vote for Poilievre is really a vote for the Trump types. Well, let's see what Trump himself thinks. Well, a few days ago, when this was recorded, Trump came out and said he didn't give a damn who ran Canada. And so, you know, we can conclude from that what we might as Canadians. One thing we can conclude, and, you know, you want to put this in perspective, is that the new American administration has a lot of countries to keep track of. And Canada is the U.S.'s major trading partner, and we should get some due consideration. But that doesn't mean that the new administration has had Canada in its sights, so to speak, or even understands the Canadian political landscape particularly well. And it's my impression, and I've done some digging, that Trump didn't understand that his comments about Canada and the tariffs and his threat to turn Canada into the 51st state would be utilized by the Liberals to resurrect them from the well-deserved death they had already managed and to raise them up above the Conservatives. He didn't know that. Now you could say, well, he should have. It's like, yeah, fair enough, but it doesn't matter because he didn't. And so I don't know if he would have cared if he did know, but he didn't know. But the upshot is the Liberals have leapt ahead. Now then you might say that's no problem because Mark Carney, man, he's got the international cachet to put that orange-haired son of a bitch in his place. And then you might think, well, what does Trump think about that? And what Trump said was he'd rather negotiate with a liberal. Now, you could say, well, that's because he thinks Carney is much more confident and competent than Poilievre, who he described as no friend to him and no friend to the MAGA movement, by the way. Or you could read it, and I would read it this way, knowing something about Trump, that because Trump is radically pro-American and because the free trade era has radically come to an end, that Trump is looking at Canada thinking if Canadians are foolish enough to elect that piker Carney, who's a retread of the worst of Trudeau, although much more effective on the managerial front, let's say, then we'll be able to crush him extremely effectively at the negotiating table. We have contempt for everything he stands for, and that would be a real good thing for us Americans as we pursue our own self-interest. And so if you think that Trump is intimidated by Carney and his international expertise, you don't understand the Americans, and you certainly don't understand Trump, because not only is that not the case, and I know it's not the case because I have extensive contacts in D.C., which I have carefully developed over the last 5 years, precisely for moments like this. And they tell me what's going on. It's not like Trump and the MAGA Republicans think that Carney is a credible, canny negotiator that's going to bring them to heel. Quite the bloody contrary. Now, you know, can Poilievre step up and do a better job than Carney? Well, you know, Canadians tend to get overshadowed at the bargaining table with regards to the Americans because they're very canny negotiators, and we have a lot to learn in that regard. But what we could do, and perhaps would do, with a conservative government, if they got their act together, is foster Canadian independence from the United States in a very real way, remove borders to interprovincial trade, crisscross the country with pipelines, radically improve our fossil fuel-based economy, move our refining capacity back into Canada, develop something approximating a real industrial policy, and maybe on something approximating a wartime footing, given the magnitude of the threat from the Americans, deal more effectively with the Germans and the Japanese, for example, who've already indicated their inexhaustible thirst for Canadian resources, make ourselves into the industrial powerhouse that Canada could most clearly be, indicate our willingness to contribute to military defense in the manner that we should, given the necessity for that in an increasingly unstable world, signal to the Americans thereby that we're willing to pursue our weight, but that we don't bloody well need them if push comes to shove, and then sit down with them at the negotiating table like a real competitor and contender and potential ally. And if you think it's going to happen under Carney, well, you can take Trump at his word. He already indicated his contempt for the liberal types. And he said that, you know, he's no friend of Poilievre. Well, you know, you want to read behind the lines a little bit. And as far as I can tell, what that means is that Trump would rather deal with a contemptible, weak-kneed liberal than with a conservative who actually puts Canada first. And so don't be thinking that Carney's the guy with the cachet to put Trump back on his heels, because Trump has faced people who are a lot more intimidating than Carney. And it's not only that, like, Carney stands for everything that the more radical fringe of the Democratic Party stands for in the United States. And it's not like Trump has any sympathy for the Democrats as a whole, and certainly not for the more leftist eco-fringe of the Democrats. And it's clearly the case that if Carney was an American politician, he'd be Gavin Newsom. Like, he'd be exactly the sort of person that's pushed exactly the policies that Trump can't tolerate that have emanated from the Democrats. And so it's a delusion. So Carney has a very impressive resume, read shallowly. And I can understand why Canadians are relying on that as an indicator of his competence. And they're also hopeful that he's a new guy, which he most certainly isn't. But if you look into what he's actually done and what the consequences have been, and if you actually assess what he said in his book, Values, for example, where it's written down in black and white, you find that if we elect Carney in Canada, which at the moment looks like a reasonable likelihood, we're facing the same situation that we faced under Trudeau, except Carney will be more effective at implementing it. And so we're going to do worse faster and with a lot more virtue signaling. And that's hard to believe because, you know, Trudeau virtue signaled to a degree that was virtually impossible as he impoverished Canada to no positive end whatsoever on the environmental front. And all that's going to happen is that that's going to be much worse under Carney. So we already see that Carney's set at serious odds, for example, with Danielle Smith in Alberta. And that's a continuation of the scrap that Smith and the West has been having with Trudeau and the Liberals and the East as a whole. That's not going to rectify itself. It isn't even obvious to me that the country itself, which the Liberals for the last 10 years have regarded as an entity with no real central identity anyways, it isn't obvious to me at all that the country's going to be able to survive another 4-year round of liberal, utopian, globalist, environmentalist, net zero catastrophe. And so don't be thinking that Carney's a new guy. And don't be thinking that his stellar resume indicates that he's going to produce some kind of economic revival in Canada. Because all the evidence points to the fact that he's going to continue to pursue the net zero delusions that he's already established as the center of his entire edifice of thought. And if you don't believe me, and maybe you don't want to or can't, or you doubt me, read Values yourself. And then you'll see, read the first 3 chapters and the last 3 chapters, because the middle of it's just boilerplate. It's only there to make the book thick instead of pamphlet length. And so an hour of reading and you'll figure out who Carney is. Now, if you believe that carbon dioxide output on the part of Canada constitutes an existential threat of the sort that requires us to become poverty-stricken over the next 40 years, well, we virtue signal about how the planet could be saved while doing absolutely nothing about actually addressing any true environmental problems, then Carney's your guy.